Right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this week's CSSGJ seminar, the last one in our spring semester series. I'm very pleased to welcome Elif Uzgoren, Associate Lecturer at the Department of International Relations, Associate Professor, I should say, Dokuz Eylül University in Turkey. And I'm particularly very pleased to welcome Elif today because she's going to launch her book with us, The Political Economy of Turkey's Integration into Europe. And in a way, that project goes right back to Elif's PhD, which she did at Nottingham University between 2008 and 2012. At the same time, coming out now, this book is also much more than Elif's PhD. There has been considerable additional research gone into writing the book. And really, if we look at the relationship between the European Union and Turkey, there's no other scholar who has followed these relations as closely and intimately as Elif has done over the last decade or so. So I'm very pleased, Elif, that you're going to join us this evening to present your book. Fantastic cover already. We are proceeding in the usual manner. Yeah, Elif, you have about 35 to 40 minutes for your presentation, and then we have an equal amount of time roughly for discussion and debate. Okay, Elif, thank you.
Okay.
Over to you.
Thank you, Andreas, and thank you to all the participants. Yes, this is the cover, The Political Economy of Turkey's Integration into Europe. And it's correct. I finished my PhD in 2012, but afterwards I continued to research the topic in a changing context, especially in 2010s. I was trying to publish the work as academic articles, and meanwhile I renewed some of the interviews. And this book is an outcome of three periods of interviews, let's say. This is my outline. So I want to start with aims and contributions of the book to the literature, questions and methods. Then I'll go through the overview of the chapters. Turkey, European Union relations. Turkey and Europe, the relations with Europe historically, there has always been Turkey and European relationship. Once Ottoman Empire, for instance, was defined as by some circles as the sick man of Europe. So a form of relationship has always been there, but it was after the Second World War and in the Cold War context that Turkey formed an association partnership with Ankara Treaty following Greece. But then Turkey was excluded from the waves of enlargement. It applied for membership in 1987. The European Commission found Turkey eligible, but not ready. And meanwhile, in its avis, the Commission stated that Europe was occupied with completing the single market. Turkey then followed the steps to complete the customs union, and it has been the only country that completed customs union and the liberalization it envisaged before attaining the membership status. And I particularly, my interviews uncovered two different decades. In 2000s, there was a very pro-European atmosphere in Turkey, a pro-enlargement atmosphere in European politics. Then Turkey was often described as a non-BRICS emerging market with a moderate form of Islam and the expectation that the Justice and Development Party would consolidate democracy in Turkey with enlarging the middle classes. And Muslim Democrats consolidating democracy. And in the last decade, in the 2010s, there is a reverse historical conjuncture with developments, the crisis of liberalism. There is the enlargement is off the agenda in Europe, often discussed as polycrisis in European politics. And in Turkey, we see the rise of authoritarian neoliberalism. So in my interviews uncover these two periods and discusses change and continuity as well in the hegemonic struggle. Uh, I will start with aims and contributions and then continue with the chapter overview. Um, in the theoretical chapter, I'll have an engagement with post-Marxist critique and a reply from historical material scholarship for sure. And the next chapter provides a historical reading of Turkey's political economy, and the following three chapters basically present the empirical analysis. First, the contributions. I want to highlight two contributions in particular. The first one is that it's as an overall book in Turkey European Union relationship or enlargement literature, an application to the Turkish case. I try to present an overall analysis of a critical political economy perspective to Turkish enlargement case. For sure, there are critical studies in the literature because, as we can see, it's been more than 50 years, 5 decades, that we see Turkey's attempt to integrate with European structures. So there is a well-developed literature in Turkey relationships, let's say, but from a critical point of view, there are few studies. Um, on the left, Turkey, it's in Turkish, but Turkey, European Union, um, Turkey and European uh, Community and Union. It's a 3-volume book published in the 1990s by Tekili and Ilkin. They uncover the position of actors, social actors at the domestic politics. Um, we have Erol Manisalı in the middle, Turkey and European Union relations. This book is also provides a critical lens presenting Europe as an imperialist power and decoding the unequal exchange between Turkey and Europe. We have Axel Gehring analysis, articles, and a book in German referring to the need to develop a critical analysis of Turkey's enlargement to Europe. But these books do not particularly rely on empirical study, and they are in Turkish and English and in German. So there is not an overall critical political economy perspective in English presented as a class struggle between different societal forces in Turkey in two different historical contexts. We have Galip Yılmaz and Asuman Göksel's intervention published in an SSCI article, Uluslararası İlişkiler in English International Relations, which highlights the need to develop a historical perspective, a critical political economy perspective to the topic, but they do not have supported with an empirical study. So it's in that sense, it's the first overall book in English to present it as such. We have Gramscian historical material scholarship, Van Apeldoorn, Van der Pijl, Robinson, highlighting the main coordinates and the struggle at the global level, and the application to enlargement by Andreas Bieler, Otto Holman, and Stuart Shields in different enlargement cases, but Turkey has not been discussed overall as a book so far in English. And the second contribution is via its empirical study. We have Müftüler Baş, Çiğdem Naz, Yonca Özer's book on Turkey and European integration achievements and obstacles. We have Atilla Eralp and Nilgün Arısan Arap's chapter on an edited book called "What Went Wrong in Turkey Relationship," and we have Reiner's and Ego Turhan's intervention as a book, which uncovered the position of social actors, but labor position is completely omitted in such books, and alternatives is either discussed as alternative foreign policy orientations uh, like Shanghai Five, for instance, or a regionalization with Turkic states, or President Erdogan once in a couple of years actually suggested Turkey to participate to Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Eventually, Turkey became a dialogue partner, but it's more about, especially in the last decade, 2010s, alternatives are mostly discussed with reference to alternative foreign policy alignments rather than alternative socioeconomic contents or projects. And the position of labor is completely omitted in these analyses. Alternatives is also discussed in relation to alternatives to full membership. So when we say alternatives in the literature, it's mostly either foreign policy alignment or alternatives to full membership, like privileged partnership, for instance, or a position in the concentric circles and the future form of European Union, let's say, but not in relation to alternative socioeconomic orders, potentially by the position of labor and other disadvantaged groups from globalization. I want to highlight four merits of such an approach in explicating Turkey-European Union relations. First, one is about compartmentalization in the literature. In the political economy literature on Turkey, state society nexus, there is an emphasis to highlight the impact of globalization without a reference to regionalization. I'm sure, I mean, there are exceptions to that. For instance, the work of Gehring, but still, majority of studies in IPE, in international political economy, prioritize globalization and neglects the role of Europe in Turkey's integration with global world economy. When, as such, it neglects the European dimension. And when we look to the European studies literature, I think the theoretical skepticism in the European politics or European studies literature at the European level can also be observed for the literature on Turkey-European Union relationship. Often there is this neglect of critical studies, particularly the feminist studies, and the studies that highlight socioeconomic power hierarchies. So that's why in this compartmentalization, I think Gramscian historical materialism-based way to discuss, in general, the European politics within globalization, but also the position of social forces at the Turkish domestic level within the condition of the international. So that's why I think it in that sense paves the way to overcome this compartmentalization. The second reason or merit that I want to highlight is about the fact that in the literature on Turkey-EU relations, mostly the focus is on the end state of negotiations. So the question comes and it is asked as, will Turkey ever become a member or not? But actually this form of enlargement and this focus on the form of enlargement in the debate neglects the current power dynamics or hierarchies and the current socioeconomic content of ongoing integration, because integration continues, is an ongoing process. and there is a power hierarchy, especially as Turkey completes the customs union and liberalizes its economy without any social mechanisms for disadvantaged groups, especially as it's liberalized its economy with Europe and it's highly integrated economically. So there is a neglect on the ongoing power relationship and power hierarchies as such. The third reason is the fact that Gramscian historical materialism paves the way to understand the relation as an open-handed class struggle, ultimately opening the floor to discuss the agency behind ongoing integration and then question alternatives and alternative socioeconomic orders. And the last reason is obviously the conception of the relation as an integral relationship between politics and economics and between civil society and political society. So these are the research questions in the book. The book has 2 chapters for 2000s to discuss the position of capital, labor, and the struggle in the state institutions, political society, political parties, and struggles in social factory of capitalism. So for 2000, the question the book asks, was there a hegemonic project in Turkey regarding membership in the 2000s? If so, which social forces supported it? And was there an alternative? And could they form a united front? And for the last decade, which is the last empirical chapter for 2010s, how have the globalization, crisis of liberalism, and the COVID-19 pandemic impacted the coordinates of corporate relations? How did pro-membership social forces continue to support the membership perspective? And for the 2000s, how has the position of labor and other struggles changed in the last decade? Methodologically speaking, the empirical data relies on 109 interviews in total, 69 of which I conducted during when I was a PhD student in 2010 and 2011. Then I repeated some interviews, and I here refer to 20 interviews in 2017. And the last round I conducted in 2022 and 2023 before the publication of the book. I interviewed 5 categories of actors: representatives of capital, labor, political parties, state institutions, and representatives of social forces around the struggles of ecology, human rights, patriarchy, and migration. I incorporated migration in the last round, particularly, and I asked them 5 categories of questions, and I asked each question to each interviewee. For sure, we discussed, they were keen on speaking more about some categories, but I asked all the questions to all the categories of actors. I started with globalization, and then for the 2010 year, the last round, I asked whether they were influenced from deglobalization or how they were influenced from the COVID-19 pandemic, for instance. The effects of participation in the internal market and Eurozone, social policy, foreign policy, democratization. So I tried to figure out how they took a position for all. Methodologically speaking, although in terms of interclass struggle, the main dynamic of Turkey's integration with global political economy is still internationalism. So it more relies on trade rather than foreign direct investment, although Turkey's foreign direct investment increased in the last couple of years, but it's still mostly trade. So I discussed the class struggle in relation to internationally and nationally oriented labor and capital groups. And there, for internationally oriented capital and labor, I picked textile and automotive industries, which are really the main export sectors after 1980's neoliberal turn in Turkey. And for nationally oriented capital and labor groups, I interviewed agriculture, public services, and for nationally oriented capital, I interviewed SMEs mostly and discussed class struggle accordingly. So when we come to the chapter overview, in the first chapter, I particularly discussed the post-Marxist intervention of Lachlan move, hegemony and social strategy towards a radical democratic politics, and Harlan Negri's empire. So there has been times in the development of historical materialism when it was perceived as crisis of historical materialism. I picked these two books and these two scholarly work because somehow they both argue that there is social change and dislocations in capitalism with the rising individualism, rising and the way capitalism is advanced, let's say, with more emphasis on service economy, digitalization, individualism, and they refer to declining labor in the manufacturing sector, and they also refer to the need to problematize the new subjectivity. I mean, although they may end up with different arguments, but they have this commonality of because it's also a discussion in the historical materialist in the literature who qualifies as post-Marxist is also a debate. So it's the reason why I picked these two works is related with their assumption or the rationale behind their analysis on social change and the fact that they want to go beyond historical materialism. Lacan move particularly accuse Gramsci for economic and class reductionism, and there they propose plural and radical democracy, and they accuse, although they think Gramsci is one of the historical materialist scholars who refer to political contingency the most, but still, at the end of the day, for them, Gramsci falls to economic and class reductionism, and there is a need to open more space for struggles around political recognition. So it's not just economic exploitation, but also political domination that has to be inserted. In the chapter, I particularly highlight 4 reasons why, as an answer of historical materialist scholarship to such critiques, and this debate eventually helped me to integrate the struggles around ecology, patriarchy, migration, and human rights as the social factor of capitalism against the capitalist discipline in the following empirical chapters. So the first objection in the chapter to post-Marxist accusation is that it's a social totality. It's a social relation of production as a social totality that is discussed in historical materialism. And the accusation to post-Marxist scholarship that they operate within capitalism's dualisms, which eventually desocializes the material and sweep the whole question of capitalist domination under the rug, to refer to Ellen Mrs. Wood. The second reason is, or the answer to these accusations or the critique is that it's an integral relationship. Um, but on the contrary, it's the post-Marxist research that operates within dualisms, which eventually neglects to integrate the role of state in the hegemonic struggle and uncover the neoliberal dimensions of civil society in the struggle, in the hegemonic struggle. The role of international is the third reason for the chapter to argue for historical materialist scholarship. It's under-theorized in Laclau and Mouffe in their analysis on plural and radical democracy. But Gramscian analysis, on the contrary, operates or understands the domestic level actors within the condition of the international and refers to this unevenness of the development of capitalism. The final reason is historicism, because here I particularly refer to Adam Morton and the concept of austere historicism, which means that such a perspective stops historical materialist text to explain current conditions or contemporary conditions of capitalist dynamics. Then in the second chapter, I provide political economy reading to Turkey's state-society nexus to situate Turkey's political economy into global dynamics. I particularly start from Ottoman period, late Ottoman period, the founding of the republic, but the emphasis is more after the neoliberal turn. It prepares a historical background for the following empirical chapters, and the analyses are presented at three different levels: social relational production, forms of state, and world order. And I ended up each period as subtitles in the chapter with an emphasis on or reflections on Turkey European integration. In the 1960s, there was Fordism and import substitute industrialization in Turkey. When we look to the reflections of this analysis to Turkey's European Union, or at that time European Community relations, there was a tug of war, the chapter argues, between Keynesian development understanding and liberalism envisaged by the customs union. And some groups in Turkish society, amongst Turkey's social forces, adopted a discourse that they are the partners. They here means European powers, and we are the market. So Turkey opens the market to the partners, but we will never be a partner, as a critical tone, and Turkey should continue to have protectionism in order to industrialize its economy. It would be after the neoliberal turn as a passive revolution that Turkey applied to full membership with the neoliberal turn and the containment of the labor movement, for sure. And then in the chapter, I particularly refer to the post-2008 period as the rise of crisis of liberalism and authoritarian neoliberalism, a period in which the European Union adopted a transactional approach rather than membership per se. So the European Union highlights a strategy of picking and selecting particular topics like migration, for instance, to discuss cooperation with Turkey. Nowadays, it's more security related issues, but the reference is there particularly to migration, civil society dialogue, person-to-person dialogue, etc. So it's a transactional approach rather than integration per se. And I refer to passive revolution in reading neoliberal restructuring in the 1980s and transformismo the extension of the ruling class with the Justice and Development Party. Then I have 3 chapters presenting the empirical data, where the main reference are the interviews. The third and the fourth chapters analyze class struggle in the 2000s. The third chapter is more about the position of capital and labor groups, and the fourth chapter is political society and civil society, the struggle at the sphere of political society with the reference to political parties and NGOs. And then I present the struggle around 3 projects. There is not one pro-membership and one alternative project is the argument of these chapters, but it is the struggle in the 2000s was much more complex in the sense that there was a pro-membership project pioneered by international-oriented capital and also supported by SMEs. It is supported by Justice and Development Party regime and the state institutions linked to global economy like Central Bank, Ministry of Commerce, and Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The arguments in favor of membership were mostly related with consolidation of market economy to increase Turkey's competitiveness, to consolidate democracy in Turkey, to improve civil society in Turkey. So classical liberal arguments. But the chapter that argues that this project for membership was hegemonic actually in 2000s for 2 reasons. Because the social forces could refer to other terrains. For instance, membership was not just related to the economic corporate level, but the social forces actually could defend membership at a hegemonic level because they refer to not only simply their vested economic interests, but also they presented the EU membership at a universal level. It will be very good for Turkey to have a peaceable foreign policy, or they linked Turkey becoming a member to the European Union with the modernization project of the Kemalist era. So they could provide moral and intellectual leadership for pro-membership. Particularly, I interviewed some of the institutions in civil society like Economic Development Foundation or Turkish Economic and Social Studies Foundation. I interviewed some of the organic intellectuals in such institutions. They have organic links with capital groups, but actually they are presenting, or they did present the membership perspective they really contributed to present the membership perspective on a universal level, supposedly on an objective basis, rather than related with particular class interests. This was then, back in 2000s, challenged by 2 rival class strategies, or contested by 2 rival class strategies. The first one is Havet, as the argument goes in the book, which means no to capital Europe, but yes to social Europe. It's very similar to the position of European Trade Union Confederation to European integration. This was supported by international-oriented labor, emancipatory left political parties, and struggles in social reproduction for human rights, patriarchy, and environment. But this didn't stand back in 2000 as an overall alternative because they ended up supporting the membership perspective, though with a different rationale. They said that Turkey has already lost the battle on economy after completing the customs union. So now membership was about participating to Turkey to the European social policy, which would be positive for labor movement, and that membership would consolidate democracy in Turkey. Besides, globalization requires a struggle at the international level. An interviewee even said that globalization has dynamited the struggle at the national level. So there is a need for international struggle, and European social policy is a good platform to do that. The second rival class strategy is neo-mercantilist strategy, which is supported by nationally oriented liberal, social democrat political parties and Nationalist Action Party at that time in 2000s. That was the only social forces back in 2000s that developed a critical view on globalization related with self-sufficiency in agriculture or inefficient public sector. The public employees were particularly critical about globalization because of the discourse of presenting public sector as inefficient, which is the way to market creation for sure privatization. And Turkey experienced in the last 2 decades privatization of health and privatization of education. And agricultural self-sufficiency was another argument put forward by this group. However, they were fractured on membership question because some interviewees highlighted that Turkey has already aligned with globalization. Perhaps Europe can be a model as a self-sufficient union in its agricultural policy, thanks to common agricultural policy. They were also referring that Turkey may get funds from agricultural policy as well. On the other hand, another group was arguing that membership would mean further liberalization for Turkish agriculture because customs union does not encompass agricultural products apart from processed agricultural products. So it would negatively impact Turkish agriculture. However, they were united in their political stance, in the sense that they were critical of any form of privileged partnership. That's why neo-mercantilism more stands like, or ended up defending membership on equal terms and conditions. And it doesn't stand as an alternative because it although it raises a critical tone on political issues like the policies of European Union vis-à-vis Cyprus, for instance, agency about the relationship between Turkey and Greece, or about Kurdish question, for instance, or any form of privileged partnership, but they ended up defending membership on equal terms and conditions. That's what they propose. The last chapter is about the struggle in 2010s. There, I looked to how pro-membership social forces continue to defend membership, especially following COVID-19, for instance, and the rising geostrategic rivalry with China. They argue that the economic relations endure structurally, especially as China is not a trustable partner, and with nearshoring, onshoring, the trade between Turkey and Europe continued and increased. This is also related with the declining wages in Turkey, as Turkish capital groups and the Justice and Development Party never stopped production apart from few weeks, and with nearshoring tried to take the advantage to attract more foreign direct investment, and the transport-related carbon footprint with the ecology crisis, that the countries with the near geographies related with the ecology crisis would trade more, and Turkey is more advantaged when compared with, for instance, Mexico or Vietnam. To refer to the head of industrial policies of TÜSİAD, the Turkish Industrialists Association, compared to Turkey, transporting a container from Mexico or Vietnam to the EU, respectively, EU market produces respectively 1.6 and 1.8 times more carbon emissions. So, nearshoring and onshoring is something that they refer, and accordingly, they said that the economic integration continues. These SMEs and nationally oriented capital argued that Turkey becomes a major procurement and production hub for European market, and thanks to the policy of Justice and Development Party, they say that during COVID, Turkey kept the industry's wheels turning under lockdown, and particularly with the SMEs working and containing the labor. So we see that for the 2010s, they repeat the liberal arguments, and they develop two additional arguments: that it would be good, membership will be good for green transition, for Turkey to have circular economy model, and for digital transition in Turkey, taking Europe as a model for digitalization. But the arguments are far from being hegemonic, contrary to the period of 2000s, because they cannot go beyond defending their vested economic interests. The labor movement and struggles in the social reproduction, they increase the critical tone, their critical tone. They perceived 2010s as negative in terms of capital's attack on labor after Great Recession or with COVID-19, and Turkey never stopping the industry's wheels turning, to refer to the interview from DISC, and further expansion of capitalism in the new public spaces like education and health, or with the rising reserve army of irregular migration in line or parallel to the Syrian civil war. However, the tone of the critique to EU membership increased in the 2010s. Here, particularly, interviewees refer to socioeconomic conditions in Eastern Europe, which is seen as the last enlargement case. There is a different European model in Eastern Europe, where wages and socioeconomic conditions remain below EU average, for instance. Is a reference or is a statement of an interviewee, or Turkey shall not become a hub of cheap labor. Political argument is not convincing neither, because Turkey has adopted the acquis and did not apply it with the authoritarian turn, and the EU has no sanction mechanism, or there is the rise of far right in the European context, or they refer to Orban, for instance, and whether in Eastern Europe the democracies have been consolidated. And the EU policy is severely criticized about Syrian migration crisis as is inhuman. The ecology crisis, the European integration or the European Union is accused. They link ecology crisis with modernity, this perception of ego and nature, and with modernity, Homo sapiens putting everything on top rather than like a species among the others. So that, for instance, the advisor to the Ministry of Climate Change referred the West as and the modernity as a force that mercilessly exploited nature for profit. So it cannot be a model for ecology. In this, struggles in the social factor of capitalism also increase the critical tone that the democratic argument is evaporated, and democracies can only be consolidated by internal dynamics, domestic dynamics, rather than an international actor. The peaceful foreign policy argument that enlargement to Europe will contribute Turkey to have a peaceful foreign policy is weakened with the rising war in Europe, and Turkish, the human activists argued that the European Union turns a blind eye to socioeconomic conditions of women and the low women employment rate in Turkey, which is around 32, 35. It fluctuates, but something around that. And it's very low when compared for 72, 75% at the European level on average. And the European agricultural paradigm is criticized to be a poor paradigm, especially considering the ecology crisis with green, with brown, revolution.
5 more minutes, Elif.
Okay, thank you. I think I can manage in 5. But ultimately, the two-class rival positions, the chapter argues, fail to propose an alternative, and they still end up leveling support to membership. For instance, women activists in Turkey highlighted that the EU really contributed Turkey for making gender a mainstream issue. And still, when compared with the world, the condition of women, the legal guarantees, rule of law are major reference points for women activists. So in that sense, ultimately, they level support. The labor movement argued or also referred that the EU is the only regionalization model with a social dimension. They refer to European social model. And they, in interview, asked, why should Turkey take Shanghai Economic Cooperation as a model, a region where workers get $15 per day? So it's still a regionalization model with the income distributed more equally in the world and compared with other instances of regionalization, for sure. The labor movement argued that the value tag, so the social standards in the European Union in its free trade, work for Turkey. So the companies in Turkey that produce for European markets, so that are exporting to European market, have to pay attention to social standards. And ironically, they do not do it for the sake of labor, they say, but because there is the threat of the European Union not to export from such firms. So this value tag and social standards really works. And a few interviews also refer to the hope of workers for free movement to work in a European country for better working standards and wages. Neo-mercantilist strategy also at the end of the day in the 2010s continued to support membership as honorable membership on equal terms and conditions as long as Turkey becomes a member on equal terms and conditions, benefiting from structural funds, regional funds, and free movement of workers. But they openly say that if the labor dimension, the labor movement particularly refer that if the labor dimension is not included, or if there will be a special form of partnership outside membership where Turkey will not benefit from funds or free movement of workers, they will openly develop a negative position. So in this final minutes, I want to refer to uneven development of capitalism and uneven exchange between Turkey and Europe, reproduced consolidated in the last decade. And I particularly refer to 3 categories. The first one is this continuation of negative integration without any positive integration. So liberalization, market liberalization without any social dimension as preeminent indicator in Turkey-European relations or the main power dynamic. And this unevenness is reproduced after COVID-19 for sure, with Syrian refugee crisis and increasing reserve army, declining real wages. So it continues. The second dimension is related with the environment. It is often discussed as environmental or ecology imperialism. An interviewer from um, Struggles in Ecology, she highlighted that European multinational firms have two faces. So they keep a close eye to protect the environment in the core capitalist countries, but then they benefit from the poor environment legislation in the periphery, she says. Perhaps this can be observed also in the dynamic of the European Union as sending the waste outside of Europe while implementing a green transition policies for green transition. Here we see Turkey, India, Egypt from Eurostat documents, with Turkey leading the EU's waste as an example. And finally, I want to refer to migration dynamic. Here, particularly, I want to highlight two quotations, one from Cox, that imperialism is a rather loose concept, which in practice has to be newly defined with reference to each historical period. I think here this quotation refers to the new and old dynamics of imperialism. And here in particular, I find the reference to Alan Maxon's Wood, Empire of Capital. The imposition of market imperatives has also been the basis of the new imperialism. In this discussion at the beginning of 2000s about all the new imperialism, the reference to the market rule or market imperative. And here, for sure, we see the continuation perhaps of the role of state and how state takes a role in the implementation of or regulating international labor mobility. On the left, the top picture is from migration trend between Germany and Turkey back in the 1960s. So what we see is unskilled labor force migrating, I think almost 2.5 million or 3 million Turkish, mostly unskilled labor force migrating to Germany. The remaining two photographs are about the current trend, and I here particularly refer to Business Europe's report about migration policy at European level. So with Blue Card, because of the aging Europe, there is a need to compensate the social expenditures as well. The Blue Card is for attracting skilled labor force from the third country nationalities. And we see, for instance, Business Europe making a differentiation between skilled labor force and how they can be attracted by Blue Card. Here in particular, perhaps we can refer to the rising youth population in Turkey, asking for educational possibility or a job opportunity in European countries, and securitization of migration for irregular refugees. The EU adopting a securitization approach, and especially with populist politics, linking refugees with security as a security issue, and signing pre-admission agreements and externalizing the irregular migration, while trying to attract skilled labor force, which is also related with uneven development of capitalism and uneven exchange. So that's all I want to say. I hope I am on time.
Elif, thank you very much. I've actually got here the second code